and that it exists still today in an invisible cloak of business as usual. And it's sadly thriving since it's an accepted reality. And since there's no governing body for the private sector of each country working in a globalized system, the only existing tool to handle the true scope of human trafficking are governments and international organizations. So even though not one of them are equipped to do this alone. So we at the OSCE can offer the ear of our 57 member states, our office, our platform of cooperation with various major and key international organizations and NGOs, and we're happy to create synergies with others that are working on this issue, especially the private sector that we've worked less with, and we really hope that together we can shine a brighter spotlight on human trafficking to make the greatest impact by leveraging the purchasing power of our governments to ensure ethical sourcing of goods and services, so that this is no longer business as usual, so that taxes from our citizens do not support human trafficking, but rather protect human rights and prevent stolen labor, because that's what it is.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for your comments, and that was such a dynamic presentation full of so much information. And as Ruth had said, we will be providing a resource page where some of the reports and things that not only Ruth but other speakers have mentioned will provide for you, also the video. So look for that as we continue to build this series, and we'll be putting it hopefully on both my website and also the Global Initiative website as well. So I want to thank all of those who took the time to send in questions to the chat box. If you still have a question, please do send in a question to the chat box. We will get to as many questions as we can. We have about 45 minutes until we have to close, so we're really looking forward to an exciting discussion. So to kick off our discussion, one question that came in early on, and I think this could be a question that could go to really any of our panelists. And the question is about current international legislation. I know we've talked about some different pieces of legislation and laws that have come through, and I want to say too, particularly last year, there was a variety of interesting new initiatives and laws that were passed in the anti-trafficking field. And so the question is about revolving around the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act and the UK Modern Slavery Act, and just a question on its effectiveness and the strength of that, and how can we look for pushing in the regulatory and legislative environment either more effective or stronger legislation. Now, this is a viewpoint. I know some may have a different opinion on this, but it would be interesting to hear from the different panelists about how they feel about these two acts and you know, their initial starts, and could they be improved? Are there efforts being looked at, particularly, you know, since the California Act was an earlier act, to begin to improve those in terms of an initiative or passing of another law? So I think maybe Professor Ramasastry, maybe we'll just start with you to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Christina. I'll just be brief, and I just wanted to note, I haven't looked at the results, but Free the Slaves just did come out with a scorecard in the past couple of days focusing on the California Act and, you know, how companies are doing with respect to disclosure. I think for anyone, transparency is a good start. It's a place to get companies focused on compliance as well as the legal profession, but certainly more can be done. And the area, and I've done research and advocacy around this both at the state level and of course at the federal level, is really focusing on government procurement. And so, you know, fortunately, we've had movement with respect to the federal government in the U.S. and the federal acquisition regulations, focusing to some extent on the way in which government contractors need to have compliance programs in place with respect to human trafficking, although there are exceptions with respect to, contracts relating to off-the-shelf goods, et cetera. But we're also seeing movements now in the U.S. in particular to mirror some of the federal requirements in state legislation, because again, many states are quite big purchasers. And at the state level, for some time, we've had in a variety of states something called the Sweat-Free Purchasing Consortium that does have, similar types of codes of conduct and requirements for contractors that do contract with state governments in a variety of ways. So I think transparency is always a first step, but I don't think it's a good enough step. And I do think that procurement provides greater leverage in terms of changing corporate behavior.
You still don't want the camera?
No. Oh, yes, I can have the camera. Actually, no. Thank you so much, Professor Ramasastry. Does anyone else want to comment about?
I actually just was, along with our special representative, on a country visit to the United States, and also last July was in the UK. So I can say something, even though I haven't actually done deep research on this. But of course, California Transparency Supply Chains was very important because it's in 2010 and coming into force in 2012. It was the very first such law of its kind internationally. So it definitely put this issue on the map for retailers, and it's focused on retailers and manufacturers. And however, the problem is that it asks large companies who have gross annual receipts over 100 million globally to certify, and it doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't even actually it doesn't even require that the companies comply with this because, or the state of California doesn't list any of the companies that don't want to disclose because this information is confidential taxpayer information. So this lack of information and enforcement actually undermines the Act's intention, and I think that some organizations estimate that only about 30% of the number of companies that probably need to comply with the law are actually being identified because there's no enforcement mechanism on this. Whereas the UK one went beyond this and actually does require all companies to publish a statement on its website in terms of its policies in relation to slavery and human trafficking, its due diligence, its risk, so it must have the statement on its website and be in a prominent place. And this is anyway. So I think that, and this was enforced since I think July 2015. But I agree with Anita that the procurement, as I've talked about, what our office's focuses on, I think the procurement approach has more teeth. And Norway, for example, has a socially responsible public procurement policy and has uncovered human trafficking through this work. And then, of course, there's the executive order strengthening protections against human trafficking in federal contracts, and the FAR that came out in 2015 to implement it, which has teeth. And also, very importantly, since the U.S. is the world's largest buyer, the biggest part of the U.S. government spending-wise is the Department of Defense, and there's a separate Title 17 ending trafficking in government contracting. So right now, I know the U.S. government is coming out with guidance that may even come out in March on this, which everyone is waiting for because there are a lot of issues. And as I mentioned, I think Brazil was the first country to really take action at a government level in forced labor broadly. And I think this dirty list is well worth looking at. And there are many, I think also the EU is now trying to work on this, especially through some directives. And of course, once the EU does something that affects 27 countries, and between the OSCE countries, probably most of the major multinational companies have either headquarters or operations. So we're trying to study what all the legislation is that's relevant to this, whether it's through human rights and business frameworks or directly. And we're going to try and come up with a compendium of resources. So if anyone knows of anything that we should be aware of, we're happy to have you send it to us as well. Thank you.
Oh, Gigi wants to present. Okay. Gigi, did you want to make a comment, or we'll move on to the next question? I just see your video is up.
Oh, is it? Oh, am I on video?
It's okay. We have another question that actually relates to this, where I think it would be great if you could comment. So I can verbally ask it, and then we'll move forward if that's okay.
No problem. I've been busily answering some questions on the forum chat as well.
Oh, fantastic. That's great. Thank you to everyone who's been sending in questions. So this is a real follow-up question to what we have just been discussing. And this is from a PhD student from Northeastern University, which is right here in Boston. E.K. D. Rees is the name. And they're asking, this is someone who also has had experience in anti-trafficking working for the Dutch Rapporteur. And the question is, and this is for all the panelists, but Gigi, I think it would be great to start with you as a company, wondering whether multinationals, how do we get more multinationals, example by the California Transparency Act, and small and medium-sized enterprises involved in these issues, and what challenges they might experience in terms of capacity, information sharing, governmental pressure, and actions, and the influence of these corporations on the political agenda. So I think it's an interesting question about, how these companies and other, businesses are engaging with these laws and regulations. So Gigi, would love to hear your thoughts on that, and then Anita and Ruth respond as you see fit too. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. A typical question, and there is no solution. I think we need to move away from how can we get multinationals to do this, how can we get governments to do that. I'll give you an anecdote. I had my little nephew's birthday, and I wanted to buy him something, a toy, so I went into a toy store in Geneva. And I looked around, couldn't find anything appropriate, and I found the manager, and I asked him, can you show me which of your toys you monitor, or is there socially responsible manufacturing? Blank look. First, I as a consumer need to know to ask for that. Secondly, not just the sellers, or the vendeur that you call them here in Switzerland or France, but the managers need to know about this. He's never been asked that question before. Why would anyone ask that question? People assume that there are regulations and governments and the company is going to be responsible for that. But if you as a consumer don't ask, there's no reason for them to provide. So I asked him, there was nothing. I ended up buying a very small wooden toy made by a German company. Didn't have any certification, but it's the best I could do. But I felt terrible because I wanted to buy something. There's a shop in Brussels, I know, where you can. So how do you affect multinationals? As a consumer, not through shaming and naming, although that is one activist tactic, and we used to do that in Fairware. You can name and shame if you get it right, and you stop doing it when a company improves. Otherwise, it just becomes bashing for no reason. So it's an aspect of naming and shaming. So governments to apply regulations, that governments are always susceptible to lobby groups, but the consumer, keep going in. Go into your favorite store, whatever it may be, ask. And if the seller can't give it to you, ask for the manager and ask. Then they know that you as a consumer want that, and so therefore they're more likely to figure out ways to provide it. not the solution, but we have to start thinking about all angles of it, not just why aren't the big companies doing this and why aren't the governments doing that. I finished.
Right. Thank you so much, Gigi. Anita and Ruth, do you have any comments to that, or I can move on to the next question?
I do have something to say quickly. Well, the case in terms of the political influence of businesses, on the negative side, in terms of government regulations, California is an example. I met with the Attorney General's Office of California last week, and they kept talking about businesses and, you know, governments, democratic governments engage in consultations with civil society and businesses in putting together laws and put laws out for comment. And I don't know exactly all that happened in California, but this lack of enforcement of disclosure or having a list is, you know, due to taxpayer confidentiality, is definitely due to the influence of businesses to say this is the limit of what we'll allow you to do. On the other hand, you know, the FAR or the UK are pushing the envelope on businesses. On the positive side, businesses who are trying to do the right thing and who come together in coalitions, as I mentioned, some are doing, like the ICC, you know, and huge companies can have an influence in the countries where they do business. And whether it's Apple in China or, I don't know, the Gap in Bangladesh or some business coalition in Congo working on the conflict minerals, the companies can say to a government, we want to see these labor laws in place, these safety standards in place, these health standards in place, and so forth, or we won't do business. Some countries, probably like Turkmenistan, where I also have to deal with, there are large companies that are working there, and especially from France and Turkey, and it would be very good if those companies and their governments would also say to large, rich countries which have a low human rights profile to do more. And anyway, this is, you know, this is from my personal capacity that I'm saying this right now, but you know, this is a concern in countries where there are low human rights standards, and businesses can do something about it.
And Christina, this is Anita. I'll just add very quickly that, so I agree with what Ruth is saying, and this is back to the shared responsibility. It's a matter of collective action. But one of the discussions that the World Economic Forum Council had was that in addition to public leverage, where companies are much more openly working to affect change, you know, much of the dialogues that do happen, especially when there is a finger that's being pointed about under-enforcement of laws or a need for change, does happen behind closed doors in private dialogue. And so the nature and form of how companies exercise leverage, I think we have to be broader in thinking about, you know, there's both soft diplomacy and more open and transparent types of requests as well.
Thank you for your comments. Really, really interesting question. So the next question we have is involving what are the challenges that companies face when conducting supply chain due diligence when certain links in the supply chain are based in fragile and conflict-afflicted states? Really interesting question for current events. So Ruth, I don't know if that's something you want to start with. I think that might be a good start to begin with you.
I actually think that Gigi at DCAP might have some things to say, because I know that they worked in particular. The Swiss have been a lead, you know, which of course Geneva is the capital, on focusing on subcontractors and companies that are operating in military zones and have this Montreux document, which is a code of conduct for such organizations. But of course, I know USAID and GIZ and the UN and our office to some extent, but some have published papers on these issues, and of course there are, the Department of Defense has a code of conduct, as well as this Title VII on ending trafficking in government contracting, since it has, I think, something like 5 million contractors working globally, of course, mainly in conflict or crisis settings, so that's huge. Of course, there are, as I alluded to, there are huge numbers of people on the move when there's a crisis or a conflict, whether IDPs or refugees who become vulnerable to human trafficking. And so I think that, governments have to play in the international community, whether it's organizations such as the OSCE that also work in conflict areas in our region, such as in Ukraine, where trafficking has increased apparently due to the conflict there. So it's very important to see that these measures apply to companies that are in conflict areas, whether it's Congo and conflict minerals, or whether it's domestic workers or child soldiers or what have you. And first and foremost, I think it's the companies that are actually doing defense work.
Thank you, Ruth. Gigi, did you do anything to that?
Yeah, I just posted in the general chat the link to the Montreux document. I worked a lot on security and defense policy when I was in Brussels for 6 years, and I trained commanders in the defense forces about human security. One of the issue with the Montreux document and the code of conduct for PMSCs is that it has a nice little tiny sentence about THB, but if you don't give a manner to implement it, it's not going to happen. A big problem when you are addressing military, I'll take two separately, military and PMSC is two different things. Government has to abide by command structures and systems, etc. If you have your commander fully understanding and briefed about human security and what to do and what not to do, very good. Quick example, this was within my gender lecture. If you have a child that is in a conflict zone, looks very ragged, messed up, you have to be very careful what you do with that child. You shouldn't, for example, take the child, take them back to camp, clean them and redress them, etc. Because the mother can lose that child because of the identifying factors of being removed. This is extremely contextual. Bear with me. You have to train the front line, whoever in the military or in the humanitarian aid sector might come encountered with a vulnerable potential person that could be trafficked in the first end of the spectrum. They need to be able to communicate with the organizations that work on counter-trafficking in that region. And you have to educate, you have to give them accessible information as to who to contact. When you have a military, well, here's a tricky one, of course. Often when you have conflicts, you have a lot of prostitution that's brought in for serving conflict. My solution to that is simple, it's zero tolerance. In a command structure, you're there to participate in the conflict or help civilians. You do not use prostitution, full stop. It's simple, and there are a lot of 3-star commanders that do agree with this. NATO is doing very good gender sessions on this. To stop trafficking in military and in conflict, but of course you have a lot of scandals still with not only peacekeeping but humanitarian workers using prostitution, which is also affiliated with trafficking. So what do we do about this? You have to then open the broader picture and look at migration as a whole, particularly because our migration we're dealing with now, just picking Europe for the instance, North America is a very different situation, so is Asia Pacific. If you stick with Europe with the Syrian conflict, you have to look again at the vulnerability of people that are migrating or refugees, asylum seekers, they're different things, to make sure that people are educated about vulnerability to trafficking. This includes border guards, which things are happening. It includes transport, includes airlines. Airline ambassadors do very good work on this. So it's multifaceted, multi-contextual. A lot of actors need to be involved. You can't just write a paragraph in a document for government saying need to be aware of THB. highly more complicated and nuanced than that. I don't know if that helps anyone, but there you go.
And I'll just add one last, and Gigi, with your work with DCAF, the other side of the story is, I mean, of course, there's governments in the context of security and conflict, and that's where the Montreux document and the International Code of Conduct come into play. But there's also, for the extractive and energy sectors, the voluntary principles on security and human rights, which, you know, were drafted in 2000. And again, they also focus on the duty of the company to both engage in risk assessment around projects in complex environments, as they call them, or complex zones, and also to do so with respect to the security services they're hiring, be they private or public. So I think when you have both the Montreux document and the Code of Conduct and the voluntary principles, you sort of have a set of guidance for both the private sector piece as well as the government.
Yeah, and definitely, Anita, the framework and the guidance is key. It's the implementation that's always the question. You have so much training and so many guides on, especially in a conflict zone, rules of engagement. To make sure it is in there and fully understood and implemented is the tricky thing. That's why it's very important to concentrate on coaching at the commander level to make sure in a command structure that trickles down to everybody. And that is something that can really assist.
No, I agree. And I just think that the companies in the extractive sector or others, if they are contracting for security services, just have an important role to play as well in identifying this issue.
Yeah, and sorry, I didn't quite mention the PMSCs. Definitely, Anita, the big problem that we have here that we're not addressing quickly enough is that, of course, if it's a PMSC, you're starting to enter into the grey area, because who are they accountable to? Rarely are they accountable to governments. And then once it goes into the international law arena, then, of course, all you lawyers that are in this webinar know that that is a murky area. There might be rules that exist, such as in codes of conduct, but upholding those rules and putting penalties in place to stop that company from still working and contracting is very difficult. So that's something that still really needs to be worked on, how to get accountability into PMSCs.
And I just have one more comment of a positive story that I think will be especially interesting for Gigi. I was just in New York at a sustainable fashion show at Fordham University, and I met the son of a Liberian ambassador named Chid, who had started Africa's first fair trade certified apparel manufacturer, Liberty and Justice. And then after the war and all of these, the horrors that happened to girls and trafficking, he started a new brand called Uniform, and it's for every purchase of a uniform piece of clothing, they donate a school uniform to a child who otherwise wouldn't be able to attend school. And they're focused on women's empowerment and ethical manufacturing, and they have already seen that since it started, because they're monitoring statistics that more girls who get the uniforms are going to school and less are having early pregnancies and marriages. So it's a positive story in a post-conflict area in terms of these issues.
Great, Ruth. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you so much. A really interesting question. And to just dovetail on that, we had a question come in about just in general in Africa, but in particular sub-Saharan Africa. Does anyone know any examples of anti-trafficking legislation that addresses issues surrounding labor trafficking, including trafficking in supply chains? Ruth, I don't know if you are familiar with anything that's ongoing or current. Anita, I also know you've done some work in different regions in the world and might have also an opinion on that.
Gina, as I don't work in Africa, I don't know. Of course, we all know that unfortunately in the modern world, the not so distant past, many of the Western countries and the U.S. in particular, brought slaves out of Africa. So I know that when I was in Senegal, there was a slavery museum, and I believe that, most of the countries have laws on these issues. And I know I was in Luxor at the last hurrah of Madame Mubarak along with Libya, where she was engaging businesses in this area. And at that time, Egypt was trying to be a leader on these issues. And I know the UN and USAID have many initiatives, including one a very large initiative in Ghana that I just learned about last week. But I'm afraid I don't want to talk too much about it, because there's all sorts of ones also on coca beans, and chocolate, and I'm sure that governments have regulations, but I'm not the expert on Africa.
Anita, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. Otherwise, I'm happy to send the person who wrote the question. I think there's some interesting things going on in Ghana, and also in South Africa, possibly. But broader, I'm not an Africa expert either. So, Anita, I don't know if you are aware of any initiatives that are going on.
No, I would hesitate to speak off the cuff. No.
Okay. All right. Great. So we'll get back to you with an answer on that, because I know some people who could definitely answer that question. So the next question. Oh, go ahead.
If I can just pop in there, and I've just sent an answer on the thing, and I'm just sending something on the chat, is we actually did a seminar at the Maison de la Paix in Geneva, and I just put the link there. And we actually heard a couple of videos from Interpol that are working. Interpol actually has a regional office there, and they have been working with locals to look at child labor, in particular in the cocoa and other industries. So I've just put a link there, and if you click on the link, within that link to Interpol, it should take you to more information on that. If not, people can contact me and I can give some more on that.
Great. Thank you so much, Gigi. Also, we have an interesting question about fast fashion and this concept of fast fashion, and a few things have come in related to this, so I'm going to try to condense it. When we have, some of the larger chains like H&M, which is doing some really interesting work regarding, sustainable clothing, et cetera, within supply chains, how do we marry this idea of a conscious consumer and wanting, these ethically produced goods with this concept of fast fashion? And Gigi, I know that this would be a perfect question to ask you, so I'm going to let you take it away.
Ula, well, I'm not going to mention any names, of course. I have some issues with some of the larger companies that are promoting themselves in this area. When I worked in New York, we did a lot of work on the Global Compact, which was just happening at that time. We had a word called greenwash. Big companies can use marketing very cleverly to do that. And there's another company that I won't mention at the moment that is doing something, and consumers jump onto it. It's like the charity effect. It's a feel-good aspect. You buy this, you're doing something. There is a group that are doing an article of clothing that you buy one and they'll send one to, I think it's in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is that this product is not appropriate for the weather or the conditions or the people in this area. And so they're actually creating a false black market because these brand new things are being sold rather than being given away free. So when you see large companies that are using it as a marketing thing, you really have to question. If you can't walk in there and speak to a seller or a manager and say, well, who's doing the independent monitoring? Again, if they give you a blank look, then there's something wrong. Because when you do CSR with a large company, part of that is that you have to have that transparency with your knowledge and your supply chain. All the employees in that company need to know about that. If they don't, to me, that's suspect. So with this conscious clothing, if you look carefully at some of these companies, it's the aspect that you bring in your clothing for recycling, and then you might get a discount on new products. again, there's a big problem with this, and you have to be very careful with charities that collect clothing, because what they often do is they sell them in bulk to countries and developing countries, and it creates a false market so that local producers of fashion and clothing are undermined by these really cheap bulk imports. So if you ever see fast fashion doing this, question it, because we need to promote slow fashion. And the whole point is that the amount of work that goes into a garment, you saw by the video, and there are many videos on YouTube that show how many people go into making a garment. Doesn't matter. With the balance, you're always going to have a minimum price, which I guarantee you is going to be probably over the 15 to 20 franc mark. Don't quote me on that. To buy an article of clothing, to make sure everyone in that supply chain is not just being treated fairly, but actually get a wage that has purchasing power parity. So my answer to slow fashion and what we try to do in our shop is we're bringing back the system of having an account, having lay-by, or I think you call it lay-away in the United States, that get something of quality and spend some time getting it. Make sure it's a basic piece that you mix and match in your wardrobe. And this is something my mother and my grandmother used to do, if you think of people after the Second World War when they didn't have the means. Our problem is we don't have the means to buy, but we insist on buying and consuming, and I answered somebody in the chat about that. So we have to look at the slow food movement as an example, that we have to insist on slower fashion. You can still be fashionable, just have it slower.
Okay. Thank you, Gigi. That was a great answer. I don't know, Anita or Ruth, I just want to see if you might have some follow-up, or if not, I have another question that relates to this that I'll ask.
Well, I can just say something quickly, because as I mentioned, I was at this event about fashion, sustainable fashion, a week ago, and I was really shocked to hear that the fashion industry is the second most polluting industry in the world, and we know it's one of the worst in terms of possibility for human rights abuses, whether it's in sweatshops or it's people actually working in homes. And I also heard a really shocking statistic that an average American woman throws out 70 pounds of clothes a year. So I completely agree with Gigi, and it's also about the wearability, the duration of wearability of goods. And one of the positive things I heard in terms of women's empowerment there, because we also work on domestic servitude, is just that also some organizations are trying to work on regulating, somehow supporting women who work at home and ensuring, decent working conditions, because sometimes it is easier for a woman to work out of her home and not in dangerous and degrading work environments, as long as it's that person is not being cheated and taken advantage of for working on their own.
Thank you so much for your comments, Ruth. So I'm going to just ask, we're approaching almost the end of our time, so I'm going to ask one question, and then I think what we're going to do is go to final comments from each of our panelists to close our conversation today, so we end on time for everyone. So there was a question that was a really important question that I just want to pose, and it was a really good question to end with, too, for our discussion today. So what are some of the things that we can do to really educate the consumer, whether it's a consumer of fashion, a consumer of any really good or entity that we're buying today on the market, in terms of supply chains and just fair and ethical practices? And one of the other parts of this question that I think is so important to ask, and I think that we need to do more of this, whether it's related to our laws or whether it's related to other initiatives in terms of human trafficking, is how do we engage survivors of human trafficking in this conversation, particularly as it relates to the consumer. And Gigi, I think it would be great to hear your thoughts, and also Anita and Ruth as well.
If you wanted me to kick off, I've already written a response in the chat about this. I've done a lot of work with governments, with NGOs, etc., on survivors of trafficking for sexual exploitation. So first off, from this angle, you need to be very careful. The survivor must want to do it themselves, and they need to be aware of the impact, the consequences of that. They've been highly traumatized, and this goes for all survivors of trafficking. And secondly, you have to be very careful from a security perspective, that they're not going to be in further danger, either their lives or their families or friends' lives threatened if they become exposed. Airline Ambassadors International, for example, they have a survivor that does training with them. They train airlines to detect and identify potential victims of trafficking. They don't intervene. And I've met one of the ladies there. And you have to make sure it matches with your audience, and you have to make sure the survivor is fully on board and fully briefed on what it entails. I think it is necessary because it's only a survivor that can tell you what it is like to be trafficked. There's also a group in Switzerland that are actually, you know, when you go in a conflict zone and you have to do this conflict training, you know, how to deal with a bomb and how to avoid a terrorist, etc. There's also a group that is doing a training that puts you in a reality situation of what it's like to be a survivor. And they do this with advice from survivors, from police, etc. And I think that's a good aspect that you can do. And ultimately, yes, use survivors, but you can also use their stories without using them physically, either written or videos that are shadowed out, etc.
Thank you, Gigi. Anita and Ruth, do you have any thoughts on that? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, there was the other question, Christina, right, which was just about how do you influence the consumer, which is a separate question from the survivor. And as an educator, it's a very, very difficult thing. I run a graduate program that focuses on sustainability, and you know, as Gigi and Ruth both mentioned, you know, the web is replete with resources, and you can see the impact of what's happening in supply chains in terms of where your clothes are made. There are apps that you can use to figure out, you know, what's going on with a particular label. So we have more knowledge, we have a little bit more transparency, but yet in terms of influencing students and others to really want to purchase ethically and sustainably, it's a larger challenge. So I think it's just something that has to just really, we all in a variety of capacities have to continue this quest with respect to the consumer, especially the North American consumer.
Okay, I'll jump in as well. Thank you, Anita. That was a good segue to what I'll say. So I think that the media plays a huge role, and one of the one of the very heartening developments are things like CNN, Freedom Campaign, and Humanity United's support for the Guardian's pieces on human trafficking, and journalists like Nick Kristof and so forth to raise awareness of these issues. And I know there are journalists all over the world that are doing this. So I think that's huge, you know, public campaigns, because first of all, you just have to build awareness that this even exists. But once you do get consumers aware, then I think it is really important to engage them. And quite often, since you mentioned survivors, you know, I think, for example, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers engaged consumers and students and lawyers to influence businesses, and now Florida is a state with slave-free labor in tomato farms. Though they're still trying to boycott Wendy's. Department of Labor has a new app called Sweat and Toil, which consumers can use, and that can educate them in terms of countries and goods which may be produced with child or forced labor, and various kind of data. And I was really pleased at this National Advisory Council in the U.S., which is a network of survivors, and I met some of them in the last 2 weeks. And of course, I heard some of them speak, and including one at the UN about 10 days ago, and that's very, very powerful. When survivors can be engaged in policy and their voice can be heard, and they can also try and influence the public and governments on these issues.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for this. And now we're going to segue into final comments to conclude our panel and discussion today. And we'll start with the order in which we began. And so, Anita, we'd like to kick it off with you, and just any final thoughts or items. We've had a really robust discussion today with so many great questions. Any thoughts that you want to leave the audience on this issue as we end our discussion today?
No, I think my head is spinning as I look at all of the notes and the chats. We can see the magnitude of the problem and that there are myriad policy solutions for dealing with this. You know, I began by just mentioning a sort of image of shared responsibility as a paradigm, but not, but not delving into the details. But you heard so much about the practicalities from Gigi, the realities, and then the policy initiatives from Ruth. So I would just want to say, I think that your series is very important, because looking at different types of commodities and different sectors will really, I think, help people understand that the solutions are not broad and general, but actually are really need to fit the particular problem, and the problems are so different across different industries and regions. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita. And now we will go to Gigi.
Sorry, I'm up, right. I've said enough already, but one thing I think we forget is habit, because if you think about recycling, it's something I started when I was a young child, again, because of my grandma. Everything had to be reused, and so you just get into a habit of recycling. Consumption is a habit, and so if we develop habits ourselves, encourage our family, encourage our friends, encourage it in how we speak and present in our own business or NGO or research practices, it's that trickle-down effect that we used to talk about in the 80s as activists, and that's what can make a change. Same with slow fashion. If you look at the slow food movement, it's really gaining a lot of ground because it is more satisfactory as well. And if you can bring those elements into your day-to-day life, at least you're making a difference. You can't tackle the whole world all at once. And then encourage those around you as well. Habits, buy responsibly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gigi. Okay, so we'll now go to Ruth for final comments and thoughts.
Thank you very much. I also, like Gigi, do not have too much to say. I think I spoke quite a bit, but as the others also echoed, I think you know, there are many. It takes an army to take action on this, whether it's the individual consumer. Most trafficking is identified by people who are not law enforcement or government officials, so it is really important to educate everyone from health workers to you know, just people in the neighborhood to be aware of what this is and what it looks like. But of course, I think international organizations, governments, and big businesses have a special responsibility to do something and to use their power to make sure that this is not business as usual, to see that our taxes don't support human trafficking and that we prevent people all over the world from having their lives and their labor stolen. The main thing I always hear from victims is that they just want to get paid and have a normal life and have opportunities. And of course, the key thing for all of those who are in power is to implement the laws that already exist, because there are many, as we've already heard, many policies and laws in place. Of course, we need to continue to improve them, but it's very important to implement them and, of course, to enforce those and to make sure they have adequate resources, both financial and also human resources. And thank you very much for letting me participate on behalf of the OSCE. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you to all of our panelists today for such a robust discussion. Thank you for your work in the field, and thank you for preparing for today. This has been an extraordinary conversation. The questions have been fantastic. And to let everyone know, we are recording this. We will have that up on our website for everyone to see. We're also maintaining the text chat box, so we have your questions also noted, especially for those that we need to get back information to regarding those questions that we might still need more information. So again, this is the first of a series of webinars, and our next webinar is going to be on Thursday, March 10th at the same time, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time, or 4 p.m., 6 o'clock p.m. Central European Time. We're going to be talking about responsible recruitment via the human trafficking of migrant workers, something incredibly relevant today given the current migrant crisis. And we do hope you'll join us. We'll be sending out more information from my listserv and also from the Global Initiative and TRAC listservs as well. Again, I want to thank our panelists for their wonderful comments and work, and also to our technical assistants, gurus here at Babson, Avneet and John, for running the video and all the other technical things that we've had go on today. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us for the past 2 hours. I know it's a long time to commit during a business day to do this, but we're so grateful for your time and participation. And we look forward to talking to you on March 10th. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Okay, so we need to.
Thank you very much.